of the more central technology issues of our time, which is what happens as AI becomes a bigger and bigger part of the way societal digital systems work, and how can we keep those systems ethical? And in specific, how can companies play their responsible role in that process? So I think we've got an unusually good group to discuss that this morning, and I'm really honored and pleased by that. So let me start. I'll just introduce them in the order I'm going to ask them to speak at the beginning. Vivienne Ming is the founder and CEO of a very unusual company called Socos. She's had a long career as an engineer, long history with AI going back decades, and likes to consider herself a professional mad scientist, which perhaps she can define, but she has a real broad remit in her own work and has got some amazing experiences as a result, which she'll share with us. Paula Goldman is the Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce, and that's a relatively new position. Salesforce also has a Chief Equality Officer who has spoken at Techonomy, and one of the things I want to ask you, Paula, is how having both those functions interacts, because I'm sure there is a deep connection which we didn't discuss in the prep call. And finally, Rohit Adakla is one of the most senior people at Wipro. He has a variety of roles. He is the CIO. He also oversees Wipro Homes, which is the AI product that Wipro sells globally and operates for customers and develops, and heads the digital office. So the fact that you play all those roles, Rohit, I think in a global services and consulting firm is also super relevant. So we have a major software company, a major services and consulting firm, and a professional mad scientist. So let's start with that most unusual title. Vivienne, I know you're really great at pressing play, so can I just press play and you tell me, when you think of this issue of ethics and AI, what do you think about and what should we be thinking about, particularly with regards to companies and how they function within that?
Yeah, well, why should anyone care what the hell I have to say? Let's start there. And there goes my chai. So, yeah, well, I can live. I'll survive somehow. Something tells me I've got enough left.
Oh, okay.
I got started in this field just by dumb luck before 2000. So this was supposedly during an AI winter, one of the many where everyone just kind of walked away and thought this isn't going to be a thing. I will note during that particular AI winter, Google began its climb to becoming a $1 trillion company. Like, I'm not certain what the AI winter was, if it produced search and ad targeting and everything else that we think of as kind of basic AI today. Having said that, though, I was right there in 2000 when it just seemed like a purely academic field, and I've watched it develop. I've watched the very first face recognition systems not be able to see Black people and never get any better at it. I have watched companies build up an ethos that if you could get a hold of someone's data, you had every right to do anything with it that you wanted to. I always loved the response. There was this company called Enroll.me that had an app you could put into your browser that plugged into Gmail. And if anyone sent you any kind of mail list, you could just hit a button, a single button, and it would unenroll you from the mail list. And shock of all shocks, they were reading all of your email and selling it to ad targeting firms. And the response of the CEO was, if you were an insider, totally understandable. What the hell did you think our business model was? Do you think we were just doing this completely for free? And at the same time, if you putting your business model like as a headline on your webpage means no one will buy your product, you probably should really rethink the product. So through all of these eras where we had these misfires in racial bias, in gender bias in hiring, just this sort of rapacious use of data that has evolved to the moment we are right now, what's most interesting to me not to the exclusion of all other questions. But what's most interesting to me is why? Why is it after 60 years of AI existing and 20 years now of it being an actual practical economic engine, are we still making the same mistakes? So what I'm going to pose to you here is it's not an engineering problem. We could fix all of these problems if we truly cared to fix them. Fundamentally, this is a human problem. And I'm even going to go a little further and say it is a balance of power problem. One of the challenges here is a tiny number of organizations, and effectively 2 companies, control virtually all of the architecture behind modern artificial intelligence. And they got a pretty good lock on a lot of talent, not all of it, but a lot of it. So if you are not at Alibaba or Amazon or Google, if you are not the US or China, then much of what we're doing is kind of, at their behest almost. All the biggest models come out of organizations that have access to their infrastructure. So this is what I'm getting at, is the racial bias issues in AI are real and pernicious and profound. And the ethical moral issues, like who should a self-driving car hit? Those are real questions also. Fundamentally, we could address those problems if we actually all had a stake, if we could really have a say in how these things happen. And maybe we'll have a chance to come back to it, but there was a really interesting back and forth on Twitter between Jeff Hinton and Joy, I'm not going to produce her last name, but a researcher at MIT, who's become a big mover in this sort of, particularly around racial bias in AI, and they just could not speak the same language. He said, it's not my fault, I'm a scientist, we were never intending our models to be perfect. And she says, it is your fault, because you were the only ones that could have made it perfect. And they just couldn't find any common ground.
Well, one of the things I want to come back to is your suggestions for what we could do concretely to build better governance, which clearly in the answers to this poll, I think something our audience is convinced are necessary. So many things to follow up on there. Thank you so much, Vivian. Paula, how does a giant software company that is probably more conscious than most think about these issues? And
yeah, well,
what do you do too?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, you and I first met when I was back at Omidyar Network, and I was leading the Tech and Society Solutions Lab. And this is where we were imagining what would the infrastructure be in the tech industry to enable companies to think about ethical issues and embed that into the process of building technology. And so when this opportunity came up about 1.5 years ago to join Salesforce as Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer, it was a very hard proposition to say no to. One, given Salesforce's reputation as a company that cares about this stuff and acts on it. And 2, because I just thought, wow, what an incredible and challenging opportunity to think about how you would scale something like this. And so I want to build on I agreed with a lot of what Vivian said. I mostly always agree with a lot of what Vivian says. And what I'll say is a few things. One, we build a ton of structure and governance, and that came up in the poll, right? That the poll that people were just responding to. For example, we have a committee of our board on privacy and ethical use, and we talk quarterly about these issues and about what we see as the biggest areas of risk and positive outcomes, and how we can skew more towards positive outcomes. We have a data science review board. We have a whole ethical use team. We work across all of our product teams on a bunch of processes. For example, we do something called consequence scanning that enables teams to think through what are the unintended consequences of the work that they're doing, the product that they're going to build, and how they can mitigate those consequences. I can go into any of
charter also.
I'm sorry?
You have an AI charter also.
Exactly, right. Thank you. We have an AI charter. We have ethics folks specializing on AI ethics. I could go on. I could go into any of those and more in much more detail. But to me, the prize actually goes well beyond that structure and process. And it's about culture, And it's also about who's at the table. So you mentioned at the outset that that our ethical use issue is linked with our equality work. Equality is a core value at Salesforce. There's an equality team, and we're embedded with that team, and that is deliberate because so much of the choice around AI ethics and tech ethics in general is who's at the table and who are you building with and for. And those questions are inseparable to me. At the end of the day, the key question is AI making the world a more or less equal place, right? And that's the urgent question we have to address. And I will also say my goal, my true north, is a culture in which all Salesforce employees own these questions and in which we can embrace difficult debate about, these are not necessarily questions that always have super clear answers, but it's that spirit of actually addressing them and seeing that as a plus in our culture that's going to solve these problems.
Well, that's great. And it is really striking if you look at the results of the poll, which Josh or whoever is in charge, can I put them up? I'm not sure. Somebody should put the poll results up. Okay, just quickly, I don't want to dwell on this, but if you look at the first one, the most overwhelming response was that AI needs board level governance in companies. So the fact that you have that quarterly meeting at Salesforce is significant. And we can just quickly look at these other things. I don't think there's any earth-shaking outcomes of the other questions, but they're useful to have. So Rohit, it's interesting. I was struck in my prep that Salesforce has this AI charter, and Wipro has Ethica, which is your own sort of framework that you've articulated about ethics. Talk about how Wipro thinks about these issues, both for itself and for its many, many customers and clients.
So thanks a lot to David, and hi to everyone again. Wipro was founded in 1945, and the company's philosophy has been built on ethics all throughout. Our human values, our societal values, the whole ability to give back, and I'm not sure how many people are aware, but 2/3 of Wipro's financial interests are actually pledged for a social cause, irrevocable, directly done by our chairman. And it's very interesting that AI as a term was invented around the same time when Wipro was founded. So 1945 Wipro and 1955 is when John McCarthy coined the term, artificial intelligence. And for us, while all of us agree that AI is an earth-shattering impact to humanity, I think the basic issue that we're dealing with what we call a trust deficit. In our business, it's all about human workers and digital workers coexisting. But however intelligent we think that the human race is, we always have this questioning attitude that we will trust humans who are face to face, but I will never trust AI, which is sitting somewhere on the cloud. So the first thing they're trying to break this myth or this mistrust is, do you trust non-humans or not? That's the first question that we are grappling with. The second is that in whatever we do, we've got fantastic policies, we've got great processes. How do you ensure that ethics is weaved into every day of life? Right from interacting with a customer, to doing software development, to doing service, to doing hardware engineering, to building digital capabilities. How do you inculcate that in what I call Life 2.0, and I'll come back to this later on. And we see that AI can play a fantastic role out there. The third piece is, how do you scale out? And this entire balance between the technology objective of AI, which is to make human life more successful and easier for us to breathe in. And someone had asked me this question, that what do you think AI can do for you? And I said that if I can get 3 times my salary at 1/3 the work that I can do, then definitely AI has come of age. How do you make sure that you balance the technology objectives of what we call efficiency, of human augmentation, of bringing up the experience, and still balance with trust? And I think that's the genesis of what we built as Ethica, the framework that we have. And perhaps in due course of time, I'll share with the audience what that means. So it's all about keeping the societal values intact, keeping Wipro's ethical values intact, inculcating that in our entire ethos and tenets of the way we do business, and making sure that we make lives better for our entire 200,000 people that we have and the entire customer base of 1,000 plus that we serve for us.
Wonderful. I would like to just detour for 1 second into this question of why is this such an important issue? And I'd like to ask Vivian, why, I know you have a lot of excitement about what AI is and can make possible. Could you just articulate, the biggest possible achievements that AI may enable society to get based on your appraisal as an engineer? And maybe Rohit wants to chime in on that too. But I think we just need to set that framework, because otherwise it's unclear why we're even having this discussion.
Sure. So first, I should defend all engineers everywhere. I'm a scientist. I've written a lot of lines of code in my life, but if that counts as engineering, I think you have just tarred and feathered every engineer everywhere. I write garbage spaghetti code and then throw it at my employees to turn into something that could actually be used by somebody. So I have been in this space for a long time. And while I think I've probably to many been a voice of caution, I haven't worked in AI for 20 years because I didn't think it was going anywhere. I built education companies, I built workforce companies looking at these issues. If you want the most tangible example I've given, if you've ever heard me talk before, you probably have heard it, about, 10 years ago, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And not only was I able to hack all of his medical equipment and build an AI that could monitor him in real time and actually adjust his insulin dosing, but I did it. I did it all by myself and was able to then just share that code with companies so that they could give it to other people. I think that's one of the most amazing and underappreciated things about AI is that on one side, yes, we could imagine what happens when at virtually no cost, you can get a glaucoma diagnosis. You could potentially listen to your breathing sounds, just to throw out a project I know is in the works, even though it has not come to fruition yet. Listen to your breathing sounds and give you a COVID-19 diagnosis. What about a system that could diagnose? I've been asked this by a company, I won't name them, but to actually build an economic model that could price the cost of their bad hires. And by bad hires, I mean the straight white guys from Harvard that weren't as good as the other person they should have hired. Like the idea that you could go into any of these places, think of what an elite expert could do in a brief judgment, and then deliver that for free around the world. That to me is the promise, but it's also that it's so empowering that someone like me could see a problem and go out and potentially solve it. I've read so many papers about wage gap that I just got sick of economists ending with the statement, and women make different choices than men, as though it somehow explained anything. So I built this AI-based spider system that crawled throughout the websites of 60,000 companies, collected data about them that I thought might be related to wage gap, and found that the number one predictor of wage gap within a company, far and away, was the number of women in a leadership team. We analyzed all the pictures of their C-suite and board, and the more women there were, the lower the wage gap was. I did it all by myself in 2 days, not because I'm a genius, but because these sorts of tools are profoundly empowering. But here's where the ethics come back in, to what are currently a tiny fraction of the world's population. People that have an exceptional opportunity to learn the skills associated with it, that have somewhat rarefied ability to be part of what I call the creative economy. And the vast majority of the people on the planet are not. And this, in fact, is one of my biggest ethical concerns, is we could build an amazing tool that offers the benefits of AI to so many, and yet it so at the same time empowers a tiny portion, and we end up with wild inequality at the same time that we've lifted the base, but we've also exaggerated everything that is problematic with our society today. We need to be so much more intentional about the human side of AI. And by that, I mean literally what happens to employment when one tiny group of people have their productivity simply accelerated, and everyone else to some degree finds themselves a bit redundant.
Thanks. So Rohit, I want you to just tackle some of this too. One thing I get confused about is how much these issues are AI issues and how much they're software issues in general. But do you too have a concern about do you think of it the way that Vivian just described it? Do you see that there's a balance of power issue? Do you see that we need, and what is your what's Wipro's systematic kind of long-term diagnosis and hope for how we can keep this happening more than just in your own company and client work, but societally?
Yeah, so I think the power of AI is absolutely limitless. You know, we've tried AI in education. For example, you can now have personalized trainings for people anytime, any language, any avatar based. So you can keep your favorite rock star or your teacher from school and have that image actually talk to you. We are trying to improve the productivity of teachers themselves. How do they grade? How do they give the assignments? How do they communicate with students? We have a massive capability in the entire banking system, you know, right from customer service to know your customer. We're looking at how machines in what they call Industry 4.0 can become smarter and more efficient. And you can run literally the entire shop floor with one person who just switches on and off the button. So I think the power of AI is absolutely limitless. The cloud capabilities are immense. You can deploy them literally in a matter of seconds or minutes. The compute that we get, you know, versus what we used to get in terms of a mainframe computer about 2 decades back, like people say is available on your smartphone. That has improved a lot. And the key question that we see here is, how do we make sure that the positive news travels faster than the negative news? You know, one news of 2 bot avatars talking to each other and supposedly conspiring against a software maker. This is a social media company about 2 years back, and they actually had to shut it down. There was a medical, research company which shut down its AI engine because it was doing reverse diagnosis and trying to transcript DNA of people. So when you start having negative news like this, it travels much faster. So our charter is that how do we actually make it a little more positive? We just had a power cut, so don't worry, I'm still alive. I should be back on.
We can see your shadow. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
but I think
very mysterious looking. We can still see you.
Yeah. My teeth are shining. For the first thing that we're looking at, how do we make more positivity than negativity? That's the first thing. The second is how do we empower people rather than them being so technically sound, like Vivian said, you need to have an engineering degree. In a span of few hours, can we go ahead and provide that capability to non-computer literate or non-computer graduates who within minutes or hours can actually go ahead and test the power of AI? That's the second thing we're trying to do at what we call democratization of AI. The third thing is that how do we build basic values of truth, equality, non-bias, liberty in everything that we do? And we are trying to reincarnate ourselves right from inception, you know, through AI itself. So it's a question of scale. It's a question of democratization and making sure that you have a more positive attitude. And even our coders find it very threatening. You know, if you tell them that I have a bot that will actually go ahead and code better than you, they would rather not have it. They may work 12, 24 hours, you know, to show that they are better, but ultimately may want to retain their job. So that entire human in the loop is the other thing that we're trying to build from our side.
Yeah, that's pertinent to what I wanted to ask you, Paula. And would you also remind me, when you were going through all the things that have happened, Rohit, you know, Microsoft also decided to stop selling facial recognition to police departments, period. And a really great statement of some of these issues is in Brad Smith's book, Unusual for a Corporate Executive. I forget the title, but I highly recommend it if you want to hear he's #2 at Microsoft company person talking about why they are so worried about some of these issues. But Paula, you know, and just to refer briefly into Vivian, she talks about algorithmic justice. And one of the things she said to me, I'm just going to sort of mix people together here, was that in the prep was that to where is it? Inclusion, or is it? You have to have, if people aren't, inclusion is the key, right? To have fair software, you have to have fair systems, you have to have fair companies. And I know you referred at the beginning to Tony Proffitt's role of Chief Equality Officer, and you talked about the culture issue, which Salesforce probably more than most has addressed. But talk a little more about what concretely Salesforce is doing to try to address that. I know you equalized women's pay at one point and still are trying to work on that, but give a little more color to what you're up to.
Do you mean on sort of the equality, diversity, inclusion?
How does it, well, if the only way we can have fair AI is if the team building it are reflective of society, what is Salesforce doing to ensure that?
Yeah, well, a lot of things, and you mentioned some of them. A lot of it is about really aggressively making sure that our pipeline looks like society, and that we are making sure that we're hiring, like we're improving those practices. It's about scorecards that we give to all of our executives that say, here's how many people of color you promoted over the last quarter. Here's how many women you promoted. Here's et cetera, right? And here's how it compared to a year ago. We are building the systems of accountability in that regard. And we have made a number of improvements, and frankly, we have a lot more work to do, right? And so, and I think we're honest and upfront about that. And I would say we see these as sort of two sides of the coin, the same coin. So one is who's at the table, within a company, and then the second is thinking about just the inputs to an algorithm itself and safeguards that you can build around that. So what's really interesting, I think, about AI, think about all the promising type of outcomes that Vivian and Rohit described, right? Whether it's helping make sure that medicine's more accurate, to helping education be personalized to specific learning goals. I mean, we could go on and on. The promise is sky high. Somehow numbers and statistical results can also somehow have a mystifying effect on people, right? So that that it sort of feels like, okay, well, this is a number, so it must be true and it must be objective. And what's really interesting is peel back, what are the sources of the data, make sure the sources of the data are representative when you're building proprietary algorithms or global models, but also I think what's kind of cool about what part of the solution to the problem is you can measure bias, right? In the same way as, you're coming out with statistical results, you can measure the bias in an algorithm against different protected groups and how vulnerable populations may fare, against majority populations. And you can do that in any societal context you wish, right? And that's an exercise that we put ourselves through when we're building.
Talk specifically about how you've done that in selling software, because that's, your massive big business.
Yeah, well, so right. And then there's also building the tools so that our customers know how to use the tool, know how to use this stuff responsibly. So for example, we have a whole suite of products, AI products that are called Einstein. And for example, we have a product called Einstein Discovery that's mostly used by data scientists. And we like to say we build technology that's as easy as possible to use responsibly, and we make it as hard as possible to use it irresponsibly. So for example, there's a feature within the Einstein Discovery suite of products that allows people to, let's say data scientists, to hide different variables from a model. For example, you might say, hey, look, I don't want race to have any part in this model, so you could hide that variable. Well, then we've built the technology to also have a little pop-up window that says, hey, you hid race. Zip code can be correlated with race, and maybe you want to hide zip code as well. So there are tools and features that we build into the actual technology that we're shipping and selling. We get a lot of positive feedback about that, but there's also decisions about what we don't build. For example, within the data science review board process that we have, at one point there was a decision to go in a different product direction. So there was a marketing product that was there was a consideration around demographic targeting. And after a lot of discussion about the potential for bias with demographic targeting, we went instead to behavioral targeting, right? And if you think about the decision tree there. Let's say you're a company and you want to sell makeup, and you might logically have an assumption that makeup, you should target women. Well, actually, there's a gender spectrum, and there are men and there are non-binary people who also like makeup, right? So you really want to sell makeup to people who want to use makeup. How do you do that, right? And I think there's decisions like that we're making all the time. We're not perfect, but we're striving to make this a conscious part of our process.
Good. Rohit, I want to go, there's so many good questions and comments that have come in, and I'm going to ask Josh to key one of those up in just a second. But Rohit, one thing I wanted you to address, and at some point, Paula, maybe too, you both companies have such a vast group of customers that you're talking to. Do the customer set start to realize that this is something they need to be thinking about? And has that changed in the last couple of years or even the last few months?
I think a bulk of our customers are still looking at how do we use AI to drive efficiency, to drive top line, to look at better profitability. But very few actually come back and ask about ethical values and the human aspect of AI. And in fact, to drive that entire value system back into customers, what we are doing Wipro on Wipro, we have actually coined this framework called Ethica, and I'll just spend a minute on it. It's an acronym. We as a company love acronyms. So it's all about being explainable, transparent, with human in the loop. It should be interpretable, have common sense built onto it, and ultimately should be auditable. And those are the principles that we are building within Wipro. Those are the principles that we inculcate in all the people, sales, pre-sales, delivery, who end up doing business with customers. And in fact, we've got a fairly transparent scoring mechanism across these 3 + 3, 6 parameters that we have. So whenever we deploy AI, we can actually give a weightage saying, how ethical is it across these 6 parameters? And we try and publish that score to customers. So they understand the values, they understand the scoring mechanism, and then they are incentivized to deploy that more and more within their company. I'll give an example. If you have something like a mortgage or a loan application, you'll take tons and tons of data from the prospective person who's going to take the loan. While we collect all the data, it's more of proving that yes, the person is who he or she claims to be. But once that toll gate is passed, we actually mask most of the data. So when we drive these values, it's all about taking trust and societal values through Ethica framework to customers. And that's the human chain that we're trying to build through AI.
Wow, great. Okay, Josh.
Yeah, so we had a question out there from someone who actually didn't want to come on video, but about training data, right? These applications require massive amounts of historical data and training data. Some of that data has, biases built into that historical data. What is the human, how do you acknowledge and adjust for the biases in the training data so that the AI doesn't continue to make sort of those same biased decisions?
Who wants to take that?
I feel like the answer was embedded in the question, right? Which is that you acknowledge that data can be biased, and you make sure that the data sets that you use are representative of the populations that you're representing in the data set, and you test for it, and there's all kinds of technical fixes that you can employ as well. But I think the answer to the question is yes, in short.
But let me bring up the example that Rohit alluded to. One I often bring up, which was Amazon and their hiring system. And I bring it up because they tried to hire me to do it. And I told them it wouldn't work ahead of time. And it didn't, for the very reason that I suspected, which is they trained it on their own hiring history, which, as you might imagine, has a pretty serious bias, as virtually every tech company would, in favor of men. It was not their intention to build a sexist hiring system, but it simply reflected their history. So that's not the end of the story, though. So then they went through and they pulled out all of the individually identifiable characteristics, all the names, all the gender markers, everything that would tell you explicitly, this is a man or this is a woman. This is often called data engineering, which used to be a way you get your papers rejected. But nowadays, apparently, it's ethical. It's interesting how things change over time. So you'd engineer the data, you change how it looks, and then you retrain the model. And here is simultaneously where artificial intelligence, machine learning, is both amazing and a little terrifying. The amazing thing is, or the terrifying thing is, it still wouldn't hire women. The amazing thing is it figured out who they were, even though we took out all the identifiable information. I was not the one involved, and I knew that would happen also because we had built this systems like this before at some of my own companies, and we'd seen this happen. So it is often much harder than you might imagine. I often like to say our current approach to issues of data and artificial intelligence is, well, the real world is hard. We're in fact going to build an AI and train it in Narnia, where good and evil is really clear. And then we'll bring it back to the real world and it will do everything correctly. And of course it won't, because we don't live in Narnia and it's never as clear as that. And let me throw out one last important consideration, which is what is the cost function for the nerds out there, but what is it that the AI is trying to optimize? Let's just be clear. It understands nothing of what it's doing. It is turning numbers into numbers. Astonishingly, profoundly powerful tool, but that's all it's doing. So it's trying to optimize something. In this case, would you get a promotion in your first year at Amazon? What does that thing optimize? Let's assume you've taken all of the redlining bias out of mortgage data. So all of our historical problems in America in offering loans, and we fixed it, and now we have this amazing loan engine, which in fact is so fast and so low cost, we don't need to wait for people to apply. We will send them loan applications for the loan that we know that they are right for. This is essentially being done out there by a number of companies. Here's the problem, and it's twofold. One is if you didn't get a loan application, you'd never know. How would you know if someone violated your civil rights? If the entire process had become so low cost that it's been turned on its head, you didn't know you were passed over for a job. You didn't know you weren't offered a loan. You didn't know that the police were using facial analysis on your face. But the other side is, even if everything works perfectly, it is only serving the interest of the bank that wants to maximize the financial value of its loan portfolio. That doesn't make the bank evil. But we have so wildly pushed the balance of power over to one side that it is hard to imagine how an individual person voices their sense of outrage at getting essentially this magical terms which will maximize the returns to the bank and put virtually all of the cost on the payee. So you have to understand we got different issues here. We have issues of bias, which are real and serious, but we also have issues of, even if this stuff works right, who does it work for?
Yeah. One thing I will say all three of you spoke about in the prep calls we had was this issue that we're never going to get this perfectly right, that there's a chronic, endless, it's like one of those classic arms races, the world will keep fighting back against attempt to make AI fair. So that's a big challenge in itself. Josh, another one?
Yeah, I'm gonna go to one of our members, Chris Maresco, who had a question. Let's see, Chris, if you're there, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question now.
Yeah, hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. I've spent the last couple of weeks deep in AI doing some natural language processing on some data. And one of the things that's beautiful, but also very frustrating is that as somebody who's developed software over the years, you wind up consuming a lot of software that other people have written. And this is especially true with AI. You've got like a black box of, natural language processing libraries that somebody somewhere has written. And you're just feeding that data. And while you have some control over the data, you don't really have any control over what's in the black box. And I suspect that 99.99% of all people developing AI systems are in that same position. Very few people are actually working in the guts of the actual algorithms and everything else deep down that are doing the AI. And in that context, how does me or anyone in my position how do we be ethical if we can't control the black box because we're just consuming a library, Spacey or NLTK toolkits or whatever? How do we become ethical?
That is sort of the $64,000 question in a way. And
yeah, I mean, on a practical level, because I mean, all the theory is great and all the board level governance is awesome, but as somebody who's at the coalface, what do we do?
I have a couple of thoughts, and I'm sure other folks do as well. One, I think what you're getting to is the transparency problem. Part of it is a transparency problem. And I think you have a lot of power, as do all the people on this call, to demand more transparency from these algorithms, right? One of the initiatives that we started and that I'm quite proud of, and actually that we learned from our peers at Google, is model cards, right? So is just like, here's a nutrition label for what's in this algorithm, right? And so I think there's a question of demanding transparency, making sure that there is a set of standards for what's disclosed around AI algorithms. And then also, I would say, a level of control that is, on derivative products, like of testing for biased outcomes, that I think is still probably in your bailiwick. But I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
So, if it's true AI, I feel it's like a child. And like I said earlier, with great power comes great responsibility. Even though people may call it as AI, you have Alexas at home, you have Siri on your mobile phones, and we really think that it's true AI, but it's still a question of trained data for a predetermined set of questions. You really can't ask it almost everything under the sun. And if true AI comes, through those algorithms, then how do you nurture a child who's, let's say, 5 years old, teaching her or him on how to ride the bike, what to say, what not to say, what to eat? In some sense, I think the responsibility comes back onto us as good corporate citizens, that we use that power of AI for the good, because whatever you teach is what AI will, come back to you on. So I think if it's true AI, the onus lies back on us in terms of how do you train and what outcomes do you drive. But onus is back on companies like us who build it. And we want to make sure that we democratize AI, like I mentioned. The way we drive it is we get a diverse set of people across geographies, across gender, across different backgrounds, and help them write code together in an agile way so that they are least biased from their side.
Hey, Rohit.
And the other thing that we try and bring in is removal of fatigue. Just like humans get fatigued, so do bots. Within a few months, you could see that the same model is decaying, which means the more data you feed, it's not learned enough, and it's churning out answers which you may not like. So how do you beat the model fatigue also? So democratization, trying to bring in a wide span of people who can actually remove biases to the maximum extent, and keeping the model current to give you as current in terms of the outcomes, is what we are trying to drive as our responsibility.
Does it sometimes happen, I presume the answer is yes, that clients come to you and say they want to do something that you feel they just shouldn't do and you can't do it for them, and you refuse?
Absolutely. I remember this customer who came back and we were just about to sign the deal. And they had people who'd been working in that line of business for more than 15 years. And the gentleman actually wanted 100% accuracy day one. And we told him that's not possible. The whole idea is that AI comes with great power, but it also takes time to learn. It's not like RPA, it's not like pure process automation. So the moment we said that, give us about 3 months to train it, and we'll get to about 80-85% accuracy, and give us another about 6 months before we get to 90 plus, he didn't sign the deal. He pushed us a lot, but we stuck to our guns. So I think that responsibility is back on us to be able to promise what is deliverable. While there is a lot of positivity around AI, there is also a big learning curve, a big hype curve. So we try and demystify it and give the practical examples to customers before we sign on the dotted line.
Great.
So let me add in a little something here that's maybe complementary to what Rohit and Paula were talking about. And in keeping with the question, assuming you're not the one building the model, I've had the chance to do that, and everything we're talking about is valid there. But I was once asked by a board of a large company, we're hiring a new CTO. How do we know if this person knows how to use AI right? What questions should we be asking the candidates? And I said, ask them to solve the problem without AI. Imagine they had an infinite checkbook. They could do whatever they wanted to solve the problem. But if they couldn't solve the problem independent of AI, there was no point at which they could have a magical black box that would do something they couldn't articulate. Then if they don't know how to solve the problem themselves, AI will not solve it for them. And I think that's one of the most important things for people to understand is the trap here that we're all talking about is you're hoping that AI will take a whole bunch of data and come up with a solution to a problem you don't even understand. That is where inevitably the bias comes in, the unintended consequences. If we knew how to solve bias in America, we would be living in a totally different country right now. We'd have been living in a different country for 500 years. If you want to solve bias in America, you have to solve the underlying problem. Having said that, AI is an astonishingly powerful tool. If you had a solution, it completely changes the economics of that solution. It makes something that sounds ludicrous. Well, what I would do is I'd hire an individual doctor for every single person, and we would do, a retinal degeneration test like every day as soon as they woke up in the morning. Well, it turns out I could build a model that could do something like that. It'll just take a look at you every time you look at your phone in the morning, and it'll do a quick check. That is because conceptually, I can solve that problem. I just need the AI to change the economics. So let me say again, if you are hoping AI will solve your problems for you, you are in for a world of hurt. Or maybe the people that you turn that loose on are in for a world of hurt. But if you can figure out the problem, to me, that is the fundamental issue with all technology, is stop thinking it will solve your problems for you. You solve the problem. Then use the technology to change the economics of that solution.
Thanks. Josh.
So we're going to try to get to a couple last quick questions, and we only have 5 minutes or so. The first question, came in about this. If you think about the business roundtable, they talked about stakeholders over shareholders. That companies exist for the common good, not just to dividends for their shareholders. How do you balance that within companies, right? You could create AI that maximizes for revenue and profits, but it may be at odds with the common good. How could businesses be held accountable? Will they be held accountable? And how do you think about, that?
That's a challenge. That's a societal question. Paula. Yeah, take a stab.
I've been thinking, my whole career, right, is about purpose-driven business, and what I'll say is two things. So one is I think we sometimes paint a false dichotomy when we talk about stakeholder capitalism, about this notion of trade-offs. And I don't want to simplify or oversimplify the issue, but I do firmly believe, and I think Salesforce firmly believes, that an approach that looks at the impact of a business on all stakeholders in the long run is a healthier approach, is a more sustainable approach, is a less risky approach to business, and a more profitable approach, right? I don't want to oversimplify that question, but it is core to our DNA. But the other thing I'll say, and I've also said this publicly, and I don't think it's a surprise, but it's like, yeah, and companies are not going to solve this problem on their own. And to expect them to is foolhardy. And that is why we need, governments to be part of this equation. It's why we need civil society out there raising topics and frankly, as a mechanism of accountability for companies. And it's why we need stronger links between tech companies and civil society. And for many years, that was not a very strong relationship, right? For decades, we saw tech sort of saying, we're going to do it on our own. We're going to disrupt things. It's going to be great. And finally, a recognition that actually government regulation really matters, and bringing civil society in early when you're designing technology really matters. And we're still kind of in the early days of figuring out those relationships. But to think that businesses are going to solve this on their own they're not. They're one part of the answer.
That goes right to Vivian's point about the asymmetry of power between countries and between companies and society. We've had people in our community who have argued that governments need to develop their own AI to counter the AI of business. Although I'm not quite sure in most countries' case how that would possibly be managed. Do we have time for another one, Josh? Let's see.
Well, and I think there was a question from Julia Reinhardt about the role and specifically about the U.S. government and plans for AI regulation. Is there, what is the government's role? Privy to any, I know specifically I'd recently spoken to Michael Kratsios, who's the CTO of the United States, and he talked about the U.S. joining the OECD Global Partnership on AI, but that's not regulation. That's just sort of sharing globally best practices, how they should be looking at it. But, what do you think? I mean, how proactive of a role should the U.S. government be taking?
Let me say, maybe I'm going to take a very American perspective here, kind of balance of power perspective. But what we need is a European option. What we need is an Indian option. We need not just America to do it, because frankly, I'm sure we have a different opinion between some of our audience members about America right at the moment, but there are some people involved in my government that I wouldn't trust to snoop through my personal data. Let me suggest a completely different space, which is, yes, there should be data infrastructure and rules in different places in the world, not just the US and China, but also what about other possibilities? At Stanford, Fei-Fei Li and John Ashmedi have called for a public option, that we should actually build infrastructure that would allow, I'm sure they're mainly thinking about researchers and scientists, but think about the opportunity for smaller companies and others to come out and build a more diversified balance of power, so that my choice is not, do I use Facebook or not, but rather, if you want to think of it, a good analogy is what are called data trusts. So this is a legal concept that's the trust idea has been around for hundreds of years, but here people collectivize their data in a legal framework of a trust. And now, in a sense, a bit like a union, you have some negotiation power. Yeah. If a big company wanted to engage with that large population of people, then you have to go through the trust.
I happen to think Facebook should have done something like that itself at the beginning, which is long too late. One thing also just to note is that there's also a China model, which is intrinsically not ethical and is being marketed aggressively around the world to other governments as we speak at quite massive scale. So that's another corollary that's quite not our discussion topic here. Rohit, I just wondered, do you have any thoughts on this issue of regulation, national competitiveness, and AI? I know we have to wrap, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
As a basic human being, if you look within, you have the right answers. Being just, equitable, with joy and happiness, that's what all human beings are. But the challenge comes when we start living in a society and we start facing hardships. we tend to lose those values, or they just get, overshadowed by all the pressures that we have in life. I think the role of governments is to put a legislative framework, a legal framework, like a constitution, which people can follow. I think that's the key role that they should play. And I feel that technology and companies like ours can be the perfect bridge between governments and citizens, and making sure that what is built or what is written gets followed both in spirit and in action. So we need all the three parties to work in cohesion to make it work.
Well, I think we've had a pretty meaty discussion. Unfortunately, we have no more time to continue it, but I really want to thank all three of you for your really, really thoughtful and quite compatible and integrated remarks and thoughts. And I'm really pleased that we were able to assemble such a great group here. So thank you so much to all three of you. Thank you to Wipro for helping support this. And I'll turn it back to Josh to wrap.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Vivian, Paula, Rohit. Yeah, thank you to Wipro for making this possible. So everyone stay healthy, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you at another event soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.